right, so this is, it's a really cool lecture because I think that it's something that you can take a lot from in terms of applying things to your real life. So we've touched on a lot of the stuff in this lecture coming up to this, but it's very much focused around this idea of kind of emergence, of this idea of groups having these properties that aren't the sum of all the individual parts, right? So when we did these case studies and looked at the rowers, you have all of these individuals that have really good stats when you look at all of them, but then you put them together and for some reason they're not performing as well as they should be. And so today's lecture will kind of look at the two different sides of performance, because there's a lot of things that happen in groups that make us perform better, but then there's a lot of things about being in a group that also just kind of result in us slacking off or having like free rider problems and what they call social loafing. So we'll get into how these all unfold and how you can kind of notice where you're at in that and what kind of the group process is doing to motivate your behavior. So today we're going to start with the kind of good sides of performance, of what is it about being in a group that helps you as the individual in that group actually perform better than you would have maybe done on your own. But then we'll look at how there's so much that goes on in group settings where just being in a group kind of results in you not performing as well as you might have if you were alone doing the same thing, right? We'll look at kind of the motivational effects of having people evaluate you and what that does to you, whether or not it's the certain types of behaviors are a lot easier to do in groups. So things that you're really good at, you're actually better at in groups, and things that you're not very good at, you're worse at in groups. We'll look at kind of coordinating with other people, people slacking off because there's group effort, things like that. And then at the end, we'll look at brainstorming, which I found actually really surprising when I started putting this all together. Brainstorming is always viewed as this like really productive, awesome thing that you do in groups to come up with new ideas, but the research actually shows that brainstorming sucks. Yeah, and we'll look at why and some of the alternatives. There is some slides at the end that get into like all of these different tasks that may be a bit much, but we'll kind of rush through those depending on time. So social facilitation. So this is this idea that there are some circumstances where being around people, being in a group of people somehow makes you better at doing whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's the instrument that you're performing, whether it's the task that you're doing at work. There's something about being around people that kind of motivates you to put more effort in. But there's definitely some caveats to that and how it happens and when it happens. So there's this idea of coaction. And so this is being in the presence of other people, but you're not necessarily interacting with them. So there's still a lot of kind of personal responsibility. It's not this like group effort. Audience is a big one. And so this is, I think, the biggest in terms of social facilitation. We tend to perform better in groups when we feel like we're being evaluated by the group. When like we feel like they're going to judge us and judge our performance, judge who we are as people. We tend to put in more effort. We tend to be more productive to show that we are a good functioning member of the group. So, and this is just kind of a caveat. We'll kind of explore this through the rest of the lecture. But this is one of those things where there was a lot of gray area, especially when people started to research this. There were some instances where they were like, oh, whoa, everybody's performing really good when they're in groups. And then there were other situations that were like, no, they're actually performing way worse. And so it led to really trying to kind of tweak the situations and the experiments to figure out what it was that was contributing to all of these different things. And so there's this guy, Zejonk, I think I'm pronouncing that right, a fun name, that really looked at the types of tasks that people were performing and came up with this idea that there are dominant behaviors, and this reflects really well with how the brain works, actually, and non-dominant behaviors. So dominant behaviors are ones that you're really good at. They're ones that are easy to learn, that you've been doing for a long time, you feel comfortable with, you feel confident about. Non-dominant behaviors are ones that are new to you, kind of complicated tasks, things that you haven't done before. There was this really cool documentary, this neuroscientist that I really like, David Eagleman. I think he did like a PBS series or whatever, but he got together with this cup stacking champion that was like 12 years old, had been cup stacking like his entire life, and he was just freaking amazing at it. And David Eagleman was cup stacking with him, but he had never done it before. He was like super slow at it. And they put EEGs on both of their heads to measure their brain activity. And the 12-year-old, while he was cup stacking, his brain was like silent, right? No activity at all. David Eagleman's brain, like doing something he had never done before, was on fire. It was just like she was thinking so much about it. And so there's something about when we get really good at things, those things get transferred to these kind of habitual parts of our brain, these procedural memory parts of our brain that kind of take over without us having to think about what to do next. And so what they kind of find from this is that when you're around other people, your dominant responses get way better. You're really good at it, you feel confident about it, it's something you don't really have to think about. But these non-dominant responses, these things that are new to you, that are challenging to you, being in a group actually makes you worse at those kind of things. And there's a lot of kind of things that tie into that we'll get into in a second. But there's a couple caveats here that this effect is really, really strong when you're having to do things quickly and you're having to produce a lot of an outcome, and more so than correctness and quality. But the presence of others in terms of these non-dominant effects hit quantity and quality of work on complex tasks. So if it's hard, if it's something that you're just not comfortable with, being around other people is going to make you really self-confident, or self-conscious, not confident. And it's going to really impact the way that you think about it. And so we'll kind of look at what might be driving a lot of this. So they talk a lot in these psychological spheres about these drive processes, motivation, and show that this is like a physiological effect, right? When you're around other people, you get into this kind of readiness, aroused state, not sexual arousal, just like heightened heartbeat, and you're ready to go. You're ready to run a race, right? And when you're in that state, that elevated state that you're in can really kind of benefit you on these dominant responses. But when you're doing things that are really challenging, that you're not used to, you tend to view a lot of that increased heart rate, increased blood pressure as a stress response, right? You feel more like it's a threatening environment that you're in rather than a challenging one that you're kind of rising to the occasion of. Yeah, Isaac?
Does that like increase with amount of people you're in front of?
To a certain extent, yeah, it does. And I think that it's kind of something that levels off. I think it's around like the 20-ish. Like if there's more than 20 people, that it doesn't get much bigger. But yeah, small groups, it's a lot less of an issue. But yeah, the more eyes you have on you, the more pressure, and also the more important that group is to you, right? If it's part of like who you are and part of your identity, this is going to be really, really threatening because you really want to belong. But it's interesting. This ties really well into kind of emotional theories with the brain and things like that, that the physiological responses are pretty much the same here. Increased heart rate, increased blood pressure and everything. But the emotion that we feel depends on how we kind of think about it and label it, right? We label all those physiological responses as a threat and as a stress response if we feel like there's a bunch of eyes on us and we're not good enough and all of those things. But that exact same physiological response may actually invoke you to feel more confident in other circumstances. So kind of building on the motivation, like what is it that's really driving a lot of this cognitive stuff that's going on? And a lot of it is this kind of evaluation, apprehension, right? Of other people are judging me, they're evaluating my effort, they're determining whether I fit in their group or not. And so the same thing is going to come up a lot, this whole idea of these simple tasks. So if you have this evaluative apprehension, you tend to kind of rise to the occasion if it's something that's simple, but then you kind of falter when it's difficult. And this goes away when you kind of take away the evaluative aspect, right? When you allow people to make private responses, you take away the audience and all of the eyes on them, then these differences between simple and difficult tasks kind of disappear. But this is a big one. This is one that we're all super concerned with, and it's like how we actually present ourselves and whether or not people are going to like us and whether people are going to accept us and rely on us in the future and build this sense of trust with other people. And so it's really this drive from avoiding embarrassment and avoiding these kind of ostracizing pressures that really drive a lot of this kind of way, this internal way that you're looking at yourself in these situations. And I thought this was a really interesting point down here. Confident individuals perform better when with others, and those who doubt their ability perform better when alone. I was talking to a friend about this, and he's just like, yeah, I mean, when people come up to me and they're trying to explain these really difficult things, I just kind of like go into a shell. I'm just like, I don't want to engage. I don't want to like try to show how good I am at it because I'm afraid of how they're going to label me and how they're going to think about me in the future. But then I go home and I look at the exact same thing, and it's like, oh, this is not that difficult. This is actually pretty easy to work through. This is something, though, confidence is usually applied in kind of a broad umbrella kind of type of way. Like there's confident people and there's unconfident people. Confident is very kind of situation dependent, right? You can be very confident at something you're really good at and be not very confident at things you're not good at. But there is kind of a trait level kind of idea here too, that there are some people that are more willing to kind of fake it till they make it. And so that does apply to more situations. But this kind of dives into kind of what might be going on under the hood in these cognitive processes, and a lot of it's related to attention, right? In order to be really good at a task, you need to be focused on that task and really be trying to understand how it works. Think of like throwing darts, or back to my good old undergraduate days of playing some beer pong, right? When you really like, what? It's like when you throw it like that? Would I throw what like that? Oh yeah, sidearm. Yeah, no. But I do remember these times like playing darts where you kind of just like turn off all of the evaluative pressure, or playing beer pong. All of a sudden you just like sink it. You're like, yeah. But then all of a sudden you start focusing on all the people around you, on the situation and all the pressure, and your attention gets divided. You're not focused on your form. You're not focused on what the actual goal is, what the target is. And all of this distraction kind of pulls you away from being able to perform as well as you probably could if you take all of that distraction out, right? So attention becomes divided between the other people, the pressure of the situation and the task, and kind of pulls you away from being able to focus on performance. But you start to see, though, too, that if it is really simple, if it's something that you're really good at, if it's a dominant behavior, then that attention doesn't really affect you because you don't really need to think about what you're doing to be good at it. And you can kind of focus on some of this other stuff and it doesn't affect you as much. So, and that's where this last point kind of really beating it in, is that if it's really complicated, if it's difficult, that's when these distractions and this divided attention is really going to hit you the hardest. And so this gets into kind of what I was saying about confidence. So confidence can be very situationally dependent, but there is kind of some personality type stuff that determines whether or not you're going to be comfortable in these situations and you're going to be more distracted than other people, right? And gets into these kind of needs for affiliation, needs for connection. That kind of stuff is really going to drive where your attention is focused in any given moment. If you have these really strong needs for acceptance, you're going to be focusing a lot more on the people around you than someone that feels very accepted and feels like they're kind of at a good place with that kind of stuff. And so these positive orientation people tend to be really self-confident, the kind of people that can kind of fake it till they make it. They look like they know what they're doing. If you think back even to kind of the stages of group membership, the initiation phase is that like usually as a new member of a group, you're not really trusted to do things, right? But that can also often be prolonged by you viewing yourself as someone that's not really good at these things. And then people see that and it kind of reinforces everything. But then kind of the other side of this, people that have kind of this negative orientation, this lack of self-confidence, are ones that tend to be very distracted in these situations, and their performance on any given task takes a big hit. It's this threatened kind of response that they view a lot of the physiological stuff as. This one, I was reading earlier. It didn't really like fit in the flow very well, but it's a really interesting idea, right? So we all know kind of what prejudices are, what biases are. And if you really think about kind of the environment that you grew up in and what was considered normal, right? If you are kind of raised in an environment where prejudices and biases and all of these things are really reinforced, they become dominant. They become things that you kind of jump to without really thinking about it. We live in a society in where a lot of these things are viewed as unfair, they're not appropriate, right? There's a lot of stigma around it. But the irony here is that because they're dominant responses, they tend to be expressed more in situations where people feel anxious. And so people are actually going to be more prejudiced, more biased, partly because of how they feel threatened by the social environment that they're in, that they're kind of defaulting to what they know and what is kind of a dominant behavioral response. This is where the frontal lobe is really nice to kick in moments like these and to really reflect on why it is that you might be engaging in those behaviors in the first place. So a lot of companies, a lot of task-oriented groups that really want to track performance have seen that like there is this social facilitation effect, that like when people feel like they're being evaluated, when people feel like they're being watched, that they perform better. And so let's just make them feel like they're being watched all the time, right? I'm sure that you can all relate that that's like not the greatest feeling in the world. It's like Big Brother effect, like what are they watching, right? So what they show is that it actually does help with the really skilled people. But just like we've been talking about, it actually hurts people that aren't very good at what they're doing. There's this evaluative pressure of like, oh my gosh, someone's watching and I don't really know what I'm doing, and that apprehension, all of that stuff kind of culminates in this loss of performance and loss of productivity, which is really ironic because that's probably the group of people that they were trying to monitor in the first place to enhance. So what they found is that it's not always a bad thing to use these monitoring services, but people usually respond a lot more positively to them when they know that it's just kind of their job that's being monitored, that it's not every waking moment of the job that they're doing, that how many minutes were you on break, and like all of these things that get tracked in these situations that you're at corporations. But this was a big one too, is that people like to have some kind of a say in what it is that's being monitored. And so if people are a part of the discussion of like, look, we're going to implement this new thing to try to improve performance, to try to understand like where everybody's at and see where the kind of weaknesses are that we can improve on. If you allow people to have a voice in that and to be a part of that, then they tend to be more okay with it, and it tends to kind of reduce this reduction in performance that you get for people that aren't very good at what they're doing. This one's super helpful for all of you that are still in school. I don't know how much longer you guys are going to be in study groups or whatever, but there's a lot of emphasis put on study groups in college settings, and like form study groups, they're super helpful, and they actually are. They show that like people that do participate in study groups tend to perform a lot better, but there's a really, really strong caveat here, and that study groups should not be used to learn new information. Because of all of these evaluative pressures that we just talked about, right? When you're in this group and you feel like you don't know things, you're actually inhibiting your ability to learn new things. And so what the really good advice here is in these study group situations is to do a bunch of studying on your own and then get together and test each other afterwards. Because then you're starting to feel confident in the material, you're starting to feel confident in the evaluative pressure that's being put on you. It turns into more of a challenge response instead of a threatening response. And you go into kind of a flow state instead of a stress state, right? You start actually learning more, you start caring about it more. I thought this was really surprising when I first saw it, because they're always pitched as just like, yeah, get in study groups. So now we'll take kind of a different turn here, and we'll look at the other side of this, because there's a lot of what are called process losses in groups. So this is what we kind of touched on a lot in that first case study that we did, where we were looking at the rowers, where you can put the best people in all of the situations. You can really figure out like who each and every person is that's really good at what they're supposed to be good at. And when you really look at it on paper, putting all of those little pieces together should produce this amazing group. But what ends up happening is that most of the time the groups don't reach their full potential when you look at what it should look like on paper compared to like what you're actually achieving. And what they find is that in these group settings, there tends to be kind of reduced effort. There tends to be these kind of group processes, these conflict processes that kind of add up and inhibit your ability to work together well and to coordinate. A lot of it kind of revolves around ineffective leadership that builds into kind of the conflict cycles and things like that. I changed this, I know it's a little bit different on yours, but it's just this idea that groups are more or less than the sum of their individual parts, right? And so there's these emergent properties of groups that they're not just individual pieces all added together. There's something about that union, that working together, that can create something more or can create something that's a lot less than what you should expect. And so this is, and I think I have a slide coming up that kind of gets at it, but it's kind of contradictory because we've just talked about all of these situations where groups make you better, and now we're saying that groups make you worse. And so there's this thing called the Ringleman effect that we really have to start thinking about this side of things more on the group side. So like the group's production rather than kind of the individual productions. And they kind of go hand in hand a little bit. But what they've seen is that when you look at these individual workers, even animals like horses and oxen, the animals, men, but they become less productive when you put them together. When you yoke the oxen together, they actually do less work than they were doing when they just had one of them hooked up. And so it's showing that like there's not this maximum efficiency that you're getting by putting all of these people together. And it's something that increases as the group gets bigger, but only to a certain point. So once you have a lot of people, it's just kind of the same effect. But as you build from like 3 people to 5 people to 10 people, you see that this effect gets worse and worse. And we'll get into each of these kind of in turn, but some of this has to do with the motivation loss, that when there's a lot of people, there's not as much motivation to put in a lot of hard work because you kind of feel like the group can accomplish it without you giving all of your effort. But then a lot of it also comes from coordination problems, of not really being able to get on the same page as the people around you and coordinate your abilities. You might all have really good abilities, but there's something about the ability to kind of put those together into some kind of cohesive whole. And so looking at kind of the motivation side, there's this idea of social loafing, which I know we are all familiar with. And it's this idea that when you're in a big group, you're not really as noticed, right? You cannot put in as much work because there's so many other people doing work as well. And a lot of the times it goes unrecognized. Even by yourself, you don't really even realize that you're putting in less effort than you might have because you're kind of thinking about what the whole group is doing. A really good example of this is tug of war, but this kind of can be applied to tons of group situations. This is just one where you can really feel the effects. That if you were on that rope yourself trying to pull, it's all you. But then you get all of these other people on the rope and you're kind of going with the flow of everyone around you. And you're able to see that like the group effort is more than what your individual effort needs to be. And this is something that even if you've got this like perfectly coordinated group where everybody's really doing everything that they need to do, there's still social loafing effects that exist that keep you from reaching your full potential. So this one's really, really hard to work out. And a lot of it is because it goes unrecognized by the group and the individual. And so this is that idea that I was getting at. So we talked about this social facilitation stuff where being in a group leads to better productivity, better efficiency, but then we have these social loafing effects that are kind of the opposite of that. So a lot of the research has tried to kind of dive into what it is that's separating these effects. And so a a big one is this idea that thinking more on the group level than the individual level. And so if you think that it's a collective effort, that it requires everyone working together, then social loafing becomes a lot more likely and a lot more possible. You can kind of not put in as much because you're more focused on the collective effort. But the big one is all of the evaluative stuff that we've talked about. And so a lot of the times in these big groups, you're not really being evaluated. Think about tug of war, right? Nobody's like, are you putting in more effort than I am? Like, you can't really tell. But when you put that evaluation into the equation, if you start watching people, if you start actually putting a number to what each individual person's doing, the social loafing tends to disappear. Almost completely. So there's something about us feeling like we're being watched that kind of makes us want to put all of our effort in. And a lot of that, again, goes and ties into these identity processes of if this group is really, really important to you, that evaluative pressure is going to be a lot more substantial than if you didn't really care about the group that you're a part of. And this is a big problem in society, in every group that you've ever been in. This is why I don't assign group projects, because I think that they're stupid. Because, I mean, you're all paying to be here. You shouldn't rely on someone else's free writing to get a grade in a class. That's just my personal opinion. But a lot of this is that if you see that the group can do it without you really putting any effort in, then it leads to this kind of tendency to just kind of free ride, to kind of reap the benefits, reap the rewards of being in the group, but really not put in a lot of effort. And this is very, I mean, the reason I bring up group projects in classes is because that's really salient, right? You get one grade for that project. And if that person sees that all of the people around them are doing really hard work, and they're like, well, I'm not getting a personal grade here, so you guys do all that work, and I'm just going to sit here and I'll get that grade at the end, and thank you. And yeah, this is something that a lot of groups try to figure out and try to figure out how to avoid, and a lot of it revolves around kind of the idea of evaluation, that it occurs less in smaller groups because you can't just kind of blend in as much. There's a lot more, it's a lot more obvious that you're not putting a lot of effort in a small group. This one was really interesting. And this one is kind of insidious and something that I'm sure you can all relate to a little bit, but there's this thing that happens when there's kind of a social stigma about being really good at something. And I think this was really prevalent, especially when I was younger, going through like elementary school and junior high and stuff, but hopefully is disappearing a little bit. But it was that whole perception of like being a nerd and like being good at math, and you didn't want to be classified as a nerd, and so you actually stopped working hard at it because of the social pressure. You didn't want to be viewed as someone that was really good at something that other people kind of viewed negatively. So yeah, this is really strong when the group members feel that the other members are really competent but are kind of lazy. But I've found this one to be kind of really interesting because it's kind of the most insidious when you think about what's affecting performance, is this kind of social stigma of being that person that's working really hard, and kind of ties into kissing butt a little bit, I guess. So we'll get into kind of these individual elements that might be affecting this. And goals is a really big one. I was talking to some of you before class that I think that our brains very much kind of gravitate towards goals, and that planning things out, setting like achievable milestones, sub-goals, working towards these big things is really, really useful, because that's how our brain just naturally works. It's constantly trying to achieve things. That's how we get our hits of dopamine. And groups can really leverage that, right? As a leader, you can create really clear, really challenging goals, things that feel really good when your group members achieve them. But I think the most important thing is kind of that you have to identify what the kind of long horizon, like big goals are, and then give these really kind of meaningful kind of milestones of getting there that keep people motivated, that keep people on track. Because people are really motivated by this. They're really productive when they can see that there's this standard, that there's some type of reward associated with kind of moving towards this quality of the work that they're expected to do. Yeah, and this is kind of a bunch of examples, right? So they've measured effort increases. People are better at planning, which is kind of an interesting one to put there because group goals themselves are a form of planning. But it allows you to really kind of get data too that feeds back into the group. If you're creating meaningful goals and things that you can actually track and things that you can measure, then you can use those as evaluative pressure on the group of saying like, look, this is where we're at, this is where we need to be. This is where everybody's kind of individual performance is landing on this kind of task that we want to do. But this is a really important one too, is that these goal-mediated processes that we have in our brain are very much centered around achieving something that we thought might not have been achievable. Like those are the things that really kind of motivate us. And so setting these challenging goals that really get people kind of motivated towards something in a way that's not super toxic. I think I brought up the whole Elon Musk space program before one of my last lectures, but he's notorious kind of for producing this kind of thing, but it motivates some really crazy innovation and drops in price and all of these things by setting these really challenging goals that keep people motivated. So another big one is promoting a sense of involvement. Competition is a good way of doing this, of allowing people to really kind of play into the competitive nature that we all have a little bit of. Some people are a lot more competitive than others, but I mean, our culture is very geared towards competition. And so allowing people to kind of feel that recognition, to feel like they're gaining something really helps. And especially when you have some type of reward associated with that, it tends to reduce a lot of the social loafing effects. But it's more so when these rewards are group-based rather than individually based. And the reward, I mean, this is really big. It has to be something that the whole group benefits from, or else social loafing is not going to go away because people aren't going to really care about what the reward is. So, and this is just kind of an overview of kind of this and the last slide, is that you need to produce some type of meaning and challenge to what people are doing. So much of our life is centered around trying to find what's meaningful about what we're doing and really pushing ourselves to be better, to achieve things. And groups need to leverage that. They need to recognize that each and every one of us have our individual pursuits, our individual desires, our need for recognition, our need for connecting with other people. And a lot of this kind of plays into that and motivates people if you can really touch into it. And it ties into, this is what I was about to say, I'm glad it was the next slide, these identity processes. I bring these up a lot just because I think that they're really, really strong. That as a leader, one of the best things that you can do is to create a reason for people to buy into what it is that you're selling, right? What it is that you're doing. Create a reason for why they want to be a part of that group, why the group's goals, the group's values, the group's meaning is meaningful to you, right? That ties into how you start to kind of shed your own kind of personal expectations about the group, your personal like ideologies about what the group should be, because you start to buy into this stuff. You start to feel like the group itself is meaningful and you don't really need to question it. And you start to loafing a lot less. You start loafing a lot less. Because the group's meaningful to you. You want to put in more work because you want the group to be successful. And this gets back to these kind of personal versus plural pronouns that people start to use when these identity processes are used correctly, right? You start to hear things like, this task is important to us. We want to achieve this. We want to be successful. And when you can start to really weed out a lot of the I want to do this, I want to be successful, I want to climb the ladder, and you start to promote more of an environment where the group goals and the group tasks really are important to each individual, you start to produce more productivity and more efficiency. I think that's one of the hardest things that businesses face, right? Because on the one hand, they're trying to accomplish something very specific, right? Everybody is coming to do their job to help the company do something specific. But it's around, I think a lot of the identity processes are things that kind of remove you from like the business side of things and promote more of an environment of inclusion, of like, I want to come to work every day because I want to be a part of the environment that this place is creating. This feels safe. I'm around people that I can connect with, that I feel like I have a strong relationship with, so I enjoy working with. Those are what produce a lot of the identity benefits. And if you can create kind of that environment, that safe and cohesive environment, then you can start to kind of make people care about the business stuff, right? It's like, we've created this awesome place for you to come and help us, but this is what we need to accomplish, and this is why it's important. And I think a really big part of achieving that from a business standpoint is allowing people to see the forest for the trees. I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of businesses take is that I've seen this, like this is a philosophy I take with like my RAs in the lab, is that a lot of labs, they take their research assistants and they're just like, fill out the spreadsheet, right? And I sit down and I'm like, look, this spreadsheet is really important because it's connected to this part of the study, and the overall portion of all of this, when we put all of these pieces together, is going to produce this like really cool publication. And so allowing people to see that they're like, that they fit into this big organized thing that has meaning, that has purpose, is really what I think kind of, and it's a challenge, and I think it's what a lot of businesses fail at, and why you've probably hated a lot of the jobs that you've had. Because this is a hard thing to promote, especially when your tasks are really boring. And so this is kind of on the value side of things, of like, what is it about kind of the positive reinforcers that you're using to motivate behavior? And the big things here are that the expectations that people have about a goal, like, is it something that I want to achieve? Is it within reach? But also the value of that goal, like, what is that going to bring me personally, or bring the group as a whole? And so motivation, productivity, efficiency, all of these things are really good when the goal is within reach. So when people actually believe that we can accomplish what we're setting out to accomplish, and they believe that there's some type of positive reward, some type of positive reinforcer at the end of all of this. So, but this is something, this is just kind of an interesting caveat here, is that a lot of the times in our own personal life, it's really easy to see how our individual goals and the outcomes of those goals kind of affect us personally. But a lot of this can get really murky when you're in a group. And I think that's exactly what you were just kind of playing into a little bit, is that that's kind of the purpose of leadership in a lot of these positions, is to take a lot of that ambiguity out, to really talk about what it is that we're expecting, what it is that we can achieve if we really work towards it, and what that means for all of us if we actually achieve it, right? And it's that message that really kind of inspires people and really motivates people. And so it's spreading the idea that, like, there is kind of group rewards that come from this, there's individual rewards that come from this, and it's stuff that we can do if we all work together. But one of the other things that I mentioned earlier on is that it's not all about these kind of motivational pressures, social loafing, and all of these kind of things. That a big reason why groups can't kind of achieve their full potential is because of these coordination problems. That you have these individuals that are really good at doing what they need to do individually, but they just have a really hard time putting those together into something that produces kind of the emergent thing that you want. And so it has to do with the resources, which you can think of as like the individual skills, the things that everybody has that they're bringing to the table, but then how those resources are kind of put together into a cohesive whole. And this is just kind of what I was getting at. If you can't coordinate that, it's not going to work well for you. Yeah, and this is very task dependent, right? And so there are a lot of tasks that coordination doesn't really matter. Because if everybody's kind of doing their own thing, if it's a divisible task where you don't really have to have all of these individual pieces coordinating with one another, so you can think of like military squads or like your professional rowers or something that require a ton of coordination. You have to be able to trust that the person next to you is going to do what they're supposed to do. But if you're in another situation where you have just some project where everyone has a little piece that they're all working towards, and then you kind of put all of those together at the end, then this kind of process loss isn't something that's going to hit you as hard. Yeah, and those are the tasks that don't require a lot of coordination. And so you don't really need to match the actions of the others around you. The group's still going to succeed. It's more about motivating kind of individual effort in those cases. So I was flipping through these slides earlier, and these next like 7 or 8 slides are not the most exciting. So this was a researcher named Steiner created this taxonomy of tasks. Because when you look at performance, and these next set of slides are really kind of from the researcher's perspective of saying, okay, we have all of these differences in performances that we've seen, depending on the group pressures, whether there's evaluation, whether there's social loafing, all of these different things. But what are the different tasks that people are doing, and do those have an effect on all of these things that we're seeing? And so they broke all of these different tasks down into ones that require different types of effort, different types of coordination. So divisible was one that I was just talking about, doesn't require a lot of coordination. So this is something where you're kind of dividing the overall task into a bunch of kind of individual pieces that everybody's working on independently of each other. A unitary task, on the other hand, is something that can't be broken down. And so you can think of like all going on a hike together. You're all trying to get to the same point, and there's not necessarily a way that you can all like do something different. You're all doing the same thing and trying to get to the same point. These are more of like a focus domain. This is more of like outcome domain of these two. So maximizing is about maximizing, and optimizing are about like what you're actually trying to achieve. And so this is a task that's really concentrated on creating just as much as you can. So you can think of like brainstorming, of creating a bunch of ideas. You can think of just production industries in general, of just trying to produce as much of something as you possibly can. Those require a different type of coordination. They require a different type of decision making and interaction between individual people. Whereas optimizing is saying like there is a specific way to do this, and we can compare it to the right way to do this. So it's not just about creating as much as we can. It's about creating the right thing, the best solution, the best outcome. So these are kind of the main overarching like categories of tasks. But then he kind of divided this down even further and said that you can have these mixtures of these that produce these specific types of situations. The first one being additive tasks. So this is something where the overall outcome at the end is determined by how you're adding each of the individual efforts together. Right? You're combining each individual one. You can think about tug of war in this situation, right? That the overall outcome is everyone's individual effort combined to produce the force that the rope is pulling on, right? So it's something that you can divide. Each person has a specific role, a specific task, and you're also trying to produce the most of something, the most force, the most effort, the most whatever. And you're summing up everybody's individual effort. But this type of task produces a huge potential for social loafing. So there's a reason why cliches exist, because they're often describing something that happens a lot. So many hands make light the work. And so this is something, like I said, it's not something that you even realize that you're doing. You don't realize that you're not putting in a lot of effort, but it's just being around a lot of people all kind of contributing to the same thing that you just kind of back off a little bit. So compensatory tasks are ones where you're just averaging everything together. I was like looking for good examples of a compensatory task this morning, and the examples were like, everybody's trying to guess the weight of an animal. I'm like, yeah, that's a great example. I mean, this is something you can kind of think of as like voting, right? Or trying to, let's say that you are trying to figure out what the opinion on a new kind of decision that you're making as a company or as a group is. You kind of put a poll out and you ask everybody, and then you just kind of take the average of all of those. what's going to happen is that you're going to kind of compensate for all the extreme judgments, right? So you're going to have some people that really hate it, you're going to have some people that really like it, but then you're going to maybe fall somewhere in the middle. The problem is that sometimes you can get a false sense that you have this kind of middle ground when really you have a lot of people that hate it and a lot of people that don't, and your average just tends to be in the middle. But what they found from the research is that a lot of the times the wisdom of the crowd actually is better than asking individuals. That when you kind of poll everybody and average all of these things together, that you get closer to the real answer. And this is pretty immune to group process laws. You can't really like fake something here. So disjunctive tasks are ones that have a single answer. I'm sure you're all really glad that this test is online and that you don't have to memorize each of these tasks that have these wonderfully rememberable names like disjunctive. But the idea is that there's just one thing that everyone agrees to. So you kind of come together as a group, you weigh all of the options, but then there's only one that you kind of pick as a group to do together. And so there's only one way of doing it, so it's unitary, and they're optimizing because there's a right way to do it. There's a solution that's the best solution. But it's something that you can't really break down into individual components. And this is something where it usually is something that the most skilled member in the group is the one that kind of decides or the one that gives the best solution. But it's only the case if that member kind of knows the answer, more importantly, shares the answer. I mean, this is something that disappears in groupthink, like we've talked about in the past, is that if there's really high conforming pressures in your group, people might know the answer, but they might be afraid to say it. And the other important thing is that the group needs to accept the right answer. So they need to actually believe that the person knows what they're talking about. And then this last one is kind of judgmental type tasks. So these ones kind of fall into the moral land and kind of the logic and math. There's a right and a wrong answer. You're kind of trying to determine what that right and wrong answer are. So think of a jury's decision. Oh, I didn't set these apart. So yeah, intellective is more of your math. Judgmental is more of your kind of moral ground. So judgmental is coming together as a group to decide what's right and wrong, whereas kind of these intellective ones are ones that have specific right and wrong. Yeah, and this is something that you can kind of intuit without having to be told, right? Is that groups are a lot better at doing tasks where there is a definitive right answer than when there's this moral gray area quicksand that you're in. It leaves a lot more room for disagreement and judgment and all of that fun stuff. So these last few slides we'll get into. Oh, there's one more. Conjunctive. I remember I was just like, God, there's so many of them. And this is one that can only be completed if everybody contributes, right? And so this is where you hear a lot of the cliches about the weakest link, right? And so you're only as strong as your weakest link. But a lot of the leadership that comes with these kind of conjunctive tasks is really putting the effort in and the work in early on to make sure that you're putting people in the correct roles that actually fit their skill sets, instead of putting the weakest link in a position that's going to kind of make the team fail. So, but a lot of the times these types of tasks really promote people to put in more effort, because it's really easy to notice that you are the weakest link and that you're the reason why the team is failing. And so you tend to see less social loafing in these types of situations. I think I picked a bad picture for this one because I don't think this is really a good tug-of-war one, but cool. All right, so this is what I was thinking I was getting into. So I kind of hinted earlier. So So brainstorming itself is often viewed in group settings as being a really good way to creatively find solutions to problems that the group may be facing. And so it's like, yeah, let's just get everybody together. Let's all share our ideas. We'll pick the best idea. We'll combine ideas. It'll be great. We'll come up with this best solution or whatever. And when brainstorming started, there was a lot of research that went into making it better, making it really work the way that it was intended to work. And so they came up with these rules that when you do proper brainstorming sessions, you're supposed to follow these precise rules. And so you're supposed to encourage everyone to really be expressive, to say whatever their ideas are. Don't be afraid of these social pressures or anything that is. Don't judge people's ideas right off the bat. So if someone puts one out, don't say, oh, that's a crappy idea, or that's not going to work, or whatever. You postpone the evaluation till the very end. And you want as many ideas. That's the whole point of brainstorming, is to just try to get a ton of ideas out there and to kind of build on and kind of combine ideas together. And so what they found from the research was that brainstorming groups were performing a lot better than normal groups, than individuals, not other groups. But it was interesting that once they told the individuals to do the same 4 rules, the individuals started to do a lot better. Yeah, so this is what I was trying to get to right here. Yeah, so they had 4-person groups that came up with an average of 28 ideas. But then when they looked at individuals were averaging 74.5. All right, says something about what's going on, right? And it's like, okay, they produced more ideas, but did they produce better ideas? And they did. Quality of the ideas in groups was a lot lower than the quality in the individual ones. The individuals had 79% of the good ideas. Like that's huge. I mean, this is just like, what an epic failure in creativity right here. And so what this led to was, okay, what is it about kind of the individual brainstorming that is producing this higher quantity and this better thing? And how can we leverage that so we can start combining ideas from other people? And so it led to kind of rethinking brainstorming in these different ways. And so a lot of what came out was like, okay, what is producing the process loss? What's producing like each of these individuals, if we take them apart, produce a ton of stuff on their own. Why is it that when we put them into a group that all of that kind of falls away? And so a big one is production blocking. And so this is where I'm sure you've all been in a brainstorming session before, that you're like sitting there and you're like all waiting your turn. And by the time it gets to you, you like forgot what your good idea was like 5 minutes ago. And so it's this idea that the delay to really get ideas out there really makes a lot of them kind of fall away. And then like new ones end up distracting you, and you're kind of pulled in all these different directions, right? And so because you're so focused on everybody and distracted on other people's ideas, that you're not really spending time generating your own. This is a huge one. I mean, this is something we've talked about a lot throughout this whole lecture, is that in these situations, like there is a rule to not evaluate other people, but like you can't tell people not to evaluate things. Like that is just something we just naturally do. Like you can see it on people's faces. You can see it in their body language. It's just like, oh, everybody hated my idea. But a lot of it too is perceptual, right? A lot of this is driven by our needs for affiliation, our needs for acceptance. And so because we have high needs, it produces this like social anxiety, this fear of embarrassment, and that it distracts us. It gets into the same stuff we were talking about at the beginning of the lecture, is that we're so focused on all of that, on our social needs, that we're not really engaged in the creative process. And the last one is this interesting one, this social matching effect, that we feel the pressure of seeing other people produce ideas, that we feel like we just have to match that level of productivity, and so we start creating a bunch of crappy ideas instead of actually like spending time on like a couple good quality ones. And the interesting thing too, this is kind of your sucker effect here, this last point here, is that if someone is producing a lot of ideas and they see that nobody else is producing any ideas, then they're like, okay, I'm gonna back off a little bit and I'm gonna match the group, or else I'm just gonna look like this like kiss up, overachiever, whatever. And so these are these ideas that like, okay, this is not just for brainstorming. You can see how this is probably going to affect any decision making that happens in groups, all of these different effects that you're trying to accomplish in terms of performance. And so what they've tried to do is to try to use, not to use face-to-face groups for the generation of the ideas, and then to kind of come together after we have a bunch of ideas to kind of work over and take things like that. So it minimizes this production blocking and the evaluative apprehension. It doesn't affect the social matching if you're using these kind of computer programs that we'll talk about. But this is big. They really like emphasize that we should follow these rules. We should pay attention to everyone's ideas and take breaks. Don't rush. Really kind of persist through this whole process. Try to be as creative as we can. And it's really important that you have someone that's kind of leading everyone through this to really get to where you want to be. But they've started, this is what I was trying to get to. So they've started this kind of electronic brainstorming wave that a lot of companies are getting into. This kind of dates this a little bit. Real-time email. It's called Slack now. But the idea was that this was a lot superior. So everybody was doing this remote, so there wasn't this face-to-face evaluative pressure. There wasn't production blocking. You could just enter ideas in as fast as you could enter them. And so you had one window that was kind of catching all of these ideas, and then you have another one that's showing everybody else's, and you're having these counters that kind of track everything that's being generated. And so this whole not waiting your turn is the production blocking. But the other things that we talked about, the evaluative pressure is going down. It enhances the idea building process. And because you're seeing other people's ideas at the same time as you're producing your own, it allows for that piggybacking to work as well, that you can really stimulate the production of these novel kind of creative combinations of other people's ideas. And I think this is the last slide. The downsides to this, there's no really good way of doing this, is what a lot of the research shows, because these do, I think, produce a lot better effects than your traditional brainstorming, but you still have a lot of coordination problems and people actually caring about why we're doing all of this in the first place. This is a big one, is that you're entering in all of your ideas, and think about, if we're just talking a 4-person group, right? The average individual produced 75 ideas. So you have 4 people producing 75 ideas. You just have this like flood of information that you're trying to keep track of. You're trying to like contribute to. It just becomes kind of a mess, right? And a lot of it's driven by that social matching. You see some person producing like 100 and you're like, oh, I got to produce 100. Or you're producing 100 and you see nobody else is, and so you slow down. Yeah, and this is the other thing, is that you become really kind of self-interested in your ideas, that you start ignoring everybody else's. And yeah, this was a really interesting caveat right here. So this was some ways that they were trying to combat this, is that they implemented memory tests. So they were like, okay, we're going to test your memory for everybody else's ideas. And that got people to start focusing on other people's and putting things together. So these are some just interesting ways to improve the performance in groups. But I think to end with, I think the really important stuff from this lecture is to really focus on your performance and your social anxiety in these social situations, and to really lean into the whole idea of this dominant versus non-dominant type behaviors. Like, really try to get comfortable with the things that you're confident about. And notice that when things are getting complicated, when things are kind of outside of your comfort zone, how is that pulling your attention? Are you focused on these other people? Are you really giving in to these social needs that are driving your performance and your ability to really engage? So that's my 2 cents for the end of the lecture. So